All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Edward Hopper's Sunlight and Solitude. Whether it is a bustling city or a Cape Cod beach, Edward Hopper's iconic paintings capture a feeling of stillness and quiet tension. Learn about Hopper's career, early influences, and how his work relates to the work of other artists from the same generation. And this is all led by the wonderful art historian Jane Oneail, who's the founder of Culturally Curious, a company that curates and delivers art appreciation programs for audiences worldwide. With a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University, Jane has worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including as executive director of the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, as well as the senior educator at the Currier Museum of Art. She has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And I again want to thank the Friends of the Library and Corning Life Sciences Foundation for their sponsorships. So all nearly 150 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jane for joining us here today. And Jane, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everybody, for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about Edward Hopper. I must admit, he is one of my all-time favorites, and we're just in for a treat. These images are so much fun to look at. I will also admit that there's a lot of images, so we'll just kind of move through them at a slightly advanced pace, probably. But our theme today, sunlight and solitude, I feel like that encapsulates so much of Edward Hopper's painting. And we've got a nice tribute to that on the screen right now. This is a work called Summertime from 1943. And we can see this lovely woman in a slightly transparent dress, just kind of soaking in this sunlight on what is otherwise an empty city street. It seems like this is a pretty significant building, portico that she is standing in. So there's always a little bit of mystery. His images tend to be easily recognizable and they tend to fascinate. So let's dive in a little bit deeper to this modern master. I do want to touch on the one term that everybody goes to when they're describing an Edward Hopper painting, and that is the term loneliness. We tend to see solitary figures that oftentimes we ourselves are disconnected from. These works, we've got an image from the Whitney Museum over here on the left, and on the right, I believe this is an image from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so we see both of these figures from behind. We don't quite know what they're up to. We can kind of project ourselves into their bodies, but we get this sense of quiet. We get this sense of maybe even a little bit of melancholy. Now, despite the fact that we associate this term loneliness or isolation with Hopper's work so much, he once commented that the loneliness thing is overdone. We still have to turn that stone over, because when we think about it, loneliness is not a subject that's often explored in our culture. And so it's really kind of rare and wonderful that Hopper lets us kind of delve into almost like a shameful part of a universal experience. So he taps into something that I think is really it's powerful, and I think it resonates. So he does this with solitary figures, and sometimes he does this just by showing us places that should be populated where there's emptiness. So this is another iconic work. I feel like every single one of his paintings is iconic. This is Early Sunday Morning from 1930. I'm just going to stop saying where these paintings are because almost all of them are at the Whitney Museum. That's they have the bulk of his collection. So we're looking at 7th Avenue at the beginning of the Great Depression, really. And there are signs of life. I mean, there's a barbershop pole and there's, various shades and curtains that have been pulled, but there are these long shadows. It must be so early that there's no activity on a New York City street. And then notice how he's added this black square at the top right of this long horizontal format painting. We read it, we understand it as being a skyscraper or taller building, but at the same time, it's a little bit ominous. That loneliness can sometimes extend to dread with just a particular color or shape here. So we have a sense of a big theme here, but let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll use our time together today. We're going to get started with a quick introduction to the artist Edward Hopper, who we can see here in a self-portrait from about 1930. And then we have a couple of places that we're going to be zeroing in on where his work is very closely associated. So we've got Paris, New York. We'll take a detour, consider Joe Hopper, his wife and partner, go back to Cape Cod. I know most people really love those Cape Cod paintings. And then these last two sections are very near and dear to my heart. So hopefully we can spend a longer time with them. Hopper's connection to movies in general and film noir specifically. And then this last section is something that I've kind of invented. I want to draw this correlation between Hopper and what else was happening in the art world in the 20th century, because his work remains fairly static. His style never really changes. But I think that he did experiment a little in very subtle ways. Okay, so we will be getting to that. But first, a very quick introduction to the artist. Edward Hopper was born in 1882 in Nyack, New York, which we can see here on the map is not too far away from New York City. He was born into a middle-class family. This is actually his home over here on the right, which is now the Edward Hopper House Art Center. So you can go there and I think even see a few of his probably smaller works on paper. Now, he had an older sister we can see from this childhood photograph, and he showed an early inclination towards the arts, and his parents were excited about supporting that, at least initially. 9-year-old Edward Hopper actually illustrated his third grade report card. That's what we're looking at over here. And we can see a little boy standing in front of the water, contemplating it with his hands behind his back as though he's some sort of sophisticated adult. But again, that sense of loneliness, that isolation, that vast expanse there, it's kind of a profound image for a young person. And I would say a really advanced drawing for a young person. Over here on the left now, we can see one of his first signed and dated works. He's still a child at this point, but it's interesting to know that when he was still so very young, he was already kind of focused on light and shadow, and that will be such a major focus in his career. Here's just another splendid example of his drawings from a young age on a lined notebook page. I also love his penmanship, but the drawings, you can see he's very much wedded to reality. Now, Edward Hopper at one point in his career essentially says, the drawing is reality. The drawing is observation. The drawing is fact and truth. But the painting is where the creativity comes in. And we'll see that sort of split in his work a little bit later on. That was his way to express his inner truth. Now, even though his parents were thrilled about his artistic inclinations early on, I think they wanted a different life for him. So when he wanted to pursue art as a career, they thought that commercial illustration would be the best route for him. And this is young Edward Hopper over here on the right. He doesn't look too thrilled with it, does he? Now, he did have some success in this field. He went to a correspondence school for learning how to be an illustrator, and he did some magazine covers for periodicals like Scribner's Magazine, Country Gentleman, and some specialty publications as well. Let me just give you a quick sense in terms of what those illustrations looked like. There's always like the germ of the seed that we see at the very beginning that spells, how things will blossom later. So we see an interest in the figure. We see an interest over here in theater. On the right, we see well-dressed gentlemen sitting at what almost looks like a French cafe, with a little bit of intrigue in this image as well. Now, Edward Hopper himself said, I was a rotten illustrator, not in the sense that he couldn't do the work, but he said he was a mediocre one because he really couldn't do art on demand. And what we'll see throughout his career is that he really struggled. He had a creative block almost all of the time. And we'll talk about how he negotiated that. But essentially, doing art on demand would have been the worst kind of work for him. So in addition to the correspondence school, in the early years of the 20th century, he also started taking classes at the New York School of Art and Design, which is like the forerunner to Parsons. And he took classes with this gentleman over here, a preeminent American artist named Robert Henry. And Henry was a really influential teacher to a number of artists like George Bellows and Rockwell Kent and Stuart Davis. So Edward Hopper was right there, sort of in the right place to be learning the skills and the methods that modern artists of the day were using. So Henry didn't have a specific approach to painting that or a specific, I would say, style of painting that he was teaching these young artists. Instead, he wanted to teach them about painting life at its toughest and most exuberant. This is an example of Robert Henry's painting of New York in the snow from 1902. Now, his paintings do tend to be a little bit darker, and we can see that while Hopper was studying under Henry, his paintings tend to be a little bit darker too. Here is a study of a model on the left and a self-portrait over here on the right from that time, from about 1906. And the darkness here, the melancholy, it was pervasive. Even his artist friends at the time said that that he could sit in front of his canvas for days at a time and produce nothing. Our other artist friends talked about how they would like to see him outside of his present condition. We'd like to see him happy. He was kind of a difficult personality, and he certainly struggled with depression. Now, despite that, he went on to find this realistic style that is, I think, embodied in an image like the one that we see on the left over here, which is called Bootleggers. This is a painting from my hometown museum, which I've always just loved. Bootleggers is Hopper's brand of realism. At first glance, it looks very realistic. We have the details of this mansard roof house over here with the porch and the bay window, kind of brings you in. And we have the mystery too, right? We have the figures in the boat who are pulling up to shore here. But then look at the other passages in this picture, particularly this tree line in the back, which could also be like some sort of ominous fog bank. We read it, we understand it as a tree line, but there's a fair amount of abstraction there. And we'll see how Hopper kind of negotiates that throughout his career. Now, we've got another self-portrait of him over here on the right, and this will be our chance to kind of summarize who he was, what he experienced in the early years of the 20th century. So he turns 18, he really comes of age right there at the turn of the century. He's in his 30s at the start of World War I and through the 1918 flu epidemic. He marries in the 1920s when he's actually in his 40s, and he's middle-aged through the Great Depression, almost 60 by the time America enters World War II. And what we'll see is that he lives this nice long life right into the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. But like I said, his art didn't really shift or change because of all of these changes that he experienced. Instead, he was just a slow burn. He would produce maybe 5 paintings a year and remain very consistent. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some experiences that shaped Edward Hopper as an artist. And the first of them, I would say, is his experience in Paris. He did 3 trips abroad during his lifetime, but going abroad for Edward Hopper really meant going to Europe and France and Paris specifically. So he's there in the early years of the 20th century, at the time that like Picasso is having breakthroughs with Cubism. But what Edward Hopper is really doing seems to be sort of immersing himself in a 19th century vision of Paris. So we actually have a Pissarro landscape over here, an impressionist landscape on the left. And then we have an Edward Hopper kind of response to this sort of landscape. He loved the light. He loved the impressionist artists. Decades later, he would refer to himself still as an impressionist. We see that he doesn't use as many short, broken, visible brushstrokes, but he is there is a painterly quality, I would say, to his works at this time, no doubt inspired by the impressionist works that he was seeing, which, remember, by the early years of the 20th century, I mean, these were fully accepted, celebrated works of art. So while he's in France, he does a lot of sitting around at cafes, observing people, different walks of life. So he made all of these little sketches of other people at cafes, fair amount of courtesans too, but they give us this wonderful slice of life and maybe even a little peek at the kinds of women that he's going to be painting later on in his career when he's in New York, women who are sitting by themselves like this. So one of the biggest, I would say, impacts or a big result from his time in Paris is this work here that's called Blue Night, or he actually entitled it Soir Bleu, which it translates from the French. This is from 1914, and it's kind of his early masterpiece. It's really unusual for an Edward Hopper painting because there's so many people in it. It features these 7 figures, and they're kind of strewn across a handful of cafe tables here. We do see a clown that seems to have just come off duty, still in full makeup, smoking a cigarette, and it almost appears as though he's sitting at a table with none other than Vincent van Gogh. So we've got the Japanese lanterns here, and we've got this background that is just dominated by these 2 fields of almost unmodulated blue here. It's a gorgeous color. And a composition like this certainly reminds me of another French impressionist, Edgar Degas, and the way he would essentially fragment his canvas by using architectural elements like this. And we can see Hopper seems to be borrowing directly from that with his cafe scene over here. So he doesn't use those traditional impressionist brushstrokes, but he's using composition and subject that the French absolutely loved. So one other quick peek at the way he kind of internalized the lessons of the French Impressionists. We've got a classic Claude Monet painting over here on the left and a sort of response to it from Hopper on the right. This is San Giorgio Maggiore at dusk from about 1912. And what we see here is a sunrise or sorry, a sunset. And we see the church in silhouette essentially, and this evening sky that is illuminated with the colors of the rainbow, and then the wonderful reflections here too. Hopper does something very similar with his railroad sunset. Now we have a silhouetted railroad architecture here set against a rainbow night sky. So it seems as though those French Impressionist lessons were always still there, but he was using a brushstroke that felt more like himself. So his enduring love for railroads, we're going to continue on with that. That's going to bring us back over to New York. And so he returns home. What does he do? Well, in the 19-teens, he is struggling. He actually gets a one-man show. He doesn't sell any of his paintings, but he does have a fair amount of success selling his etchings like we see here. And he is producing these images about living in a congested city, which was still a fairly new experience for even New Yorkers. So here, this is a view of the elevated train. We've got a figure on the far right, a man who's in shadow, and then we're looking across the train to a woman who's turned away from us and is looking out the windows of this train at like the cornice of this building and then the taller buildings beyond it. So this idea of peering into other people's lives becomes a dominant theme in Edward Hopper's paintings. And I think it's part of the allure of so many of these paintings. So here we have apartment windows on the left from 1923. This is in Philadelphia. And then night windows over here from 1928, which is in a private collection. In both of these works, you feel like you're on an elevated train, kind of passing by, just seeing a snippet of someone's life through their windows. Here we can see like a woman who looks like a maid or a domestic servant here who seems to be hard at work, unaware of us. And then over here, through an illuminated window in the nighttime, we can just see a woman in a pink slip bending over, just her rear end. So there's this sense that you're becoming a voyeur, that it's part of the city experience, that you can just glimpse into people's lives, into their windows like this, and have a momentary sense of who they are and what they're doing. And you always get the sense that you're in one of these trains just kind of passing by. So Hopper also gives us an occasional crowded restaurant, like New York Restaurant here from 1922, another unusually crowded scene for the artist. And with an image like this, we begin to see the absolute pleasure of breaking down an Edward Hopper painting, because he is so interested in color and in form. So we see all of these repeated shapes. Notice the curving form of the chairs in this restaurant. It's absolutely echoed in the shoulders of this woman that we see from behind. The big bow on the back of the server here, who's bussing all of these plates, is echoed in the plant leaves over here on the right. Even the bowl that the plant is kind of stationed in here, this yellow bowl, is the same form as this red hat that the woman's wearing. So you can find all of these kind of correlations here in what otherwise seems like a very realistic depiction of a busy restaurant, which we have to remember was still a novel thing coming out of the end of the era of the Spanish flu. So he's giving us these little snippets of life, but he is really anchoring it in his interest in color, in form, in a kind of painterly quality too here that he has just kind of gleaned, I would say, from the French Impressionists. But that brings us to a restaurant like this one. What a knockout of a painting. This is Automat from 1927. And I think most of us probably know that an automat was a restaurant that didn't have any waiters or waitresses or any cooks, really. You would just get food from vending machines. So it's like the ultimate lonely place. You go there to eat, and if you're by yourself, you don't interact with another human being. So we can see that there is a woman here alone at night. Note how he's painted the black exterior beyond this plate glass window, but he's even made it like murkier and darker, this black pyramid around this figure, almost to further isolate her. Our eyes are drawn to her because of the reflection of the lights inside that we don't see, but they almost serve as like a runway for our eyes. And then she has this stylish hat that kind of folds down towards her shoulders, seemingly protecting her, because certainly a young woman alone out at night, there's a real vulnerability there. We can see an empty plate in front of her. She's maybe finishing up the last of her coffee here, and she already has one glove on. So maybe she's just getting ready to leave. Maybe she met someone, maybe somebody didn't show up, who knows. The image is dominated by the blacks and the golds here, and then Hopper adds this splash of color near the center, but echoing the forms of the hat with the shape of the bananas here. It's a delight in terms of the form and the color and the way he puts it together, but the overall mood, of course, is that of quiet and isolation, and maybe a little bit of vulnerability here too. So we see that those same themes extended about a decade later with his iconic painting called New York Movie. He did more than 50 preparatory sketches for this one. It's a great concept here. And Edward Hopper, as we'll see, was a huge fan of the movies. So over on the left, we can just see a little sliver of the silver screen. This is a movie that doesn't seem that well attended, but we also get the sense that the main show here, at least for the voyeur that Hopper allows us to be, is this usherette who is lost in thought. And she's absolutely statuesque, right? She's got these nice long legs, and she's illuminated by these lights here, and standing just in front of these red curtains, which seem to function as her own stage here. She is unaware of us, and she certainly doesn't seem to know that she is more interesting than the movie on the screen here. So all of this sort of sets the stage for Edward Hopper's masterwork, which we should all know if we don't already love it. That is, of course, Nighthawks from 1942. And of course, there's a sense of a movie influence on this work, both going both ways. Movies have influenced it, and maybe it's influenced movies as well. Now, this is a work that has been so reproduced and so parodied in popular culture that I feel like we don't look at it closely. Let's just acknowledge some of those reproductions. This is the image that I grew up with. This was the image at a favorite family restaurant from my hometown, where it was called Boulevard of Broken Dreams, and we can see these celebrities here. But this was painted in 1984, and we can see oftentimes whenever we think of kind of a random group coming together, they're oftentimes integrated into the setting of the Nighthawks here, whether it's the folks from the Breakfast Club or Star Wars or corgis or figures from The Simpsons here. This is a familiar place to set a slate of disparate characters, right? So let's get better acquainted with Nighthawks. Now, just to set the stage here, this is in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. It was purchased for $3,000 the year after it was painted, so 1943. It measures about 5 feet across and about 3 feet tall. So it holds a wall. It's a significant painting. We zoom in a little bit closer to this familiar work. This is another work where we talk a little bit about loneliness. Hopper had kind of offered up a story as to what was going on here, but I don't really think it relates that well to what we see here. We do know that he named this work, or the work was named Nighthawks, because of this kind of beaky character, these folks kind of hanging over the edge of the diner bar here, that they kind of functioned like birds in a certain way. So let's kind of break down the picture in general. I want to address the fact that we've got this huge expanse of sidewalk. We as the viewers are sort of set outside. Notice these kind of triangular shapes where light from the inside and is overlapping itself, and we have these nice formal shapes out there. We look inside and we can see a figure here sitting from behind. We only get a little slice of his face, and then we've got these two characters, a man and a woman. We don't quite know exactly what their relationship is, right? They almost look like they're touching. They seem to be there together. He has a cigarette in his hand. She's holding a matchbook. She seems kind of heavily made up too. He's wearing a suit and a hat here, and he looks like he is engaged in conversation with this young man who almost appears like a soda jerk here. So there's again the sense that there's a story unfolding, but there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what that story is. Now, in order to make this picture, Hopper sort of thought like a movie director. He storyboarded the image, and he started with the setting, with drawing, with the fact, with the reality, according to the way he thought of drawing versus painting. And we can see then he begins to populate the image, and we can see this kind of unfolding in a series of sketches. We have the final and kind of fully resolved image over here versus the painting. And there's a couple of major differences from that final sketch to the finished painting. One of the first things I want to draw your attention to is the fact that in the drawing, we don't have nearly as much sidewalk. There's so many people that want to track down the actual diner in New York City. Nobody's ever really been able to do it because we make this leap from fact to his creative vision. It doesn't need to be a specific place anymore once we get to the painting. Another thing that he's changed is he's taken the text off of the window, off of these huge plate glass windows here, so that we can easily see everything unfolding inside this diner. And of course, part of that, it helps us sort of imagine the whole scenario as a movie. That plate glass window becomes like the silver screen itself. So there are a number of sketches that show us just how carefully he's thinking about every item on the diner counter here, and how these figures would be positioned. And then we can even see the young soda jug and how much time he spent thinking about these enormous coffee canisters that almost look like alien spaceships behind him. They're almost like another human presence in the room to a certain degree, because it is a sort of sparse space in general. Now, there's so much going on here, so much ambiguity. We will be coming back to this picture in just a little while. But I want to draw your attention right now to the redhead here. She's a pretty important person in Edward Hopper's life. In fact, she is the woman that he marries. His wife, Jo Hopper, is the muse and model for so many of his works. So Edward Hopper met Josephine, if I'm remembering her last name, Nivison, back when he was a young man, back when he was studying with Robert Henry. This is actually Henry's painting of Jo Nivison from 1906 or so. And so they met as young art students, but they didn't connect, at least romantically back then. They connected in the 1920s on a painting trip to Gloucester. They dated for about a year before they got married, and they were both in their 40s at that time. They moved into a very spare fourth floor walk-up in Washington Square North. They didn't even have their own bathroom. They had to go downstairs to use a neighbor's bathroom. There was also no refrigerator in it. So they lived a very simple, very humble life. They shared a studio. But what we'll see is that that Jo Hopper working was a major point of contention. Now, Hopper integrates his wife into a number of his images. She serves as a model for almost every female figure he paints. This is actually the only portrait that he does of her, which tells us a lot about the nature of their relationship, I think. This is a self-portrait by Jo Hopper. Now, she was a much more prolific artist. She had exhibited with significant European artists before she and Edward Hopper got together, artists like Picasso and Modigliani. And all of this sort of comes to an end when she gets married. She really puts Edward Hopper's career before her own. And Edward Hopper was really not supportive of her career. If he was serving as a judge or a jury member for a juried exhibition and she submitted work, he would always dismiss it. He might have felt threatened. Maybe he didn't want to appear like he had any favorites, but they had a fairly contentious relationship. Here we can see them in a photograph from a little bit later on in life, but they would certainly bicker quite a bit, and their relationships were very different. She was, or I should say, their personalities were very different. She was very small. She was kind of gregarious, outgoing, kind of loud. He was tall. He was more shy, reserved, conservative, sort of melancholy, and man, there would be a lot of friction between them. So they were known to not just verbally fight, but sometimes slap each other or sort of do like scratching each other, or cuffing each other. And in fact, at their 25th wedding anniversary, she joked that they should get a medal for distinguished combat. So one of the one of the kind of darker sides of their relationship is that Edward Hopper would oftentimes make these cartoons of them fighting, or these cartoons that sort of would bait a fight in some ways. So here they are in each other's faces having this debate. Here's another example of Edward Hopper leaving one of these passive aggressive drawings around the house. In this case, he's starving and he's begging her to make her some for her to make him some food. The caricatures that he made were all really one-sided, with Edward Hopper portraying himself as the victim of his wife's aggression and alleged failings as a homemaker. So Jo Hopper served an important role in her husband's work because she actually pushed him to use the medium of watercolor. Here, they're both working as professional artists, Jo Hopper less so, but we can see two examples of Edward Hopper's watercolors here that show Jo from behind. Again, I think a little hint at the nature of their relationship. Here, Jo is sketching in Wyoming, painting in the car, painting the mountains, and over here she is sketching inside their house in Truro. And I'm going to use this as a little segue to our next section, which is Cape Cod, and I think a favorite subject when it comes to Edward Hopper's work. So the couple, Jo and Edward Hopper, began to spend their summers on the Cape in Truro in 1930. In 1934, they built a house overlooking the ocean. This is the house that they built. Here's Edward Hopper later on in his life. Jo's in the background. And then you can see one of these little caricatures that he drew shortly after they made this house. He calls it the house that Jo built. It's upside down. It's bouncing around on springs. She's tending a garden in the basement here. So we get the sense that he had misgivings with the house that he attributed to her. Now, so like I said, some of his best and most well-known, most beloved images are painted in Cape Cod. This one's called the Lee Shore from 1941. These are images that are often bathed in sunshine with like deep blue water and gorgeous blue skies. And there seems to be like this wonderful sense of peace in so many of these images. You explore them a little bit deeper, and that peace might translate to something that's a little unsettling. So with the lee shore, what we have here are three sailboats that seem to be making this kind of swirling circular motion, or at least they lead our eye in that way. And that's kind of echoed by this little swirl in the clouds that we see up above. Now, one of the ways Edward Hopper adds a little bit of uncertainty to this composition is that he includes this house that seems to have a very ambiguous relationship with the water. It almost seems to be hovering out on top of the water. This sense of unease, maybe like a little bit of detachment here, of course, becomes his signature for so many of his paintings. Now, he does a number of images on Cape Cod that focus specifically on the light. This one is called Cape Cod Morning from 1950. This one's at the Smithsonian. And we see the sunshine pouring in on the side of the house. Of course, the famous Edward Hopper quote is that he says, "Maybe I'm not very normal. All I ever wanted to do was paint sunshine on the side of a house." And Jo, his wife, would have this important role where she was like an archivist of all of his work. She would write about what he was painting, how much it sold for, who they sold it to. And she would write these little descriptions. And for this one, I remember she wrote something like, "A woman in a pink dress looks out the window to assess what the weather's going to be for that day." And Edward Hopper said, "Don't do that. I'm not Norman Rockwell. I'm not trying to tell a story here. Just let it be what it is. We don't know what she's looking at," essentially. He wanted us to fill in the gaps. And I think that is the pleasure of looking at these images. And it's sort of interesting to me that we tend to always go someplace a little bit darker than, just looking at the weather. There is, I would say, almost like a sense of urgency in the way she's leaning over this desk. Not desperation, but there's something more than assessing the weather when I look at this particular image. And of course, that pink dress just serves as such a wonderful complement to all of the different greens that we see in this picture. So one other Cape Cod light image I wanted to share with you. This one is called Cape Cod Evening from 1939. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And this is another iconic image that gives us that sense of being ill at ease. We have two figures here and a dog, and everybody's kind of disconnected. There's like this gloomy light from the end of the day here. It almost looks as though this couple has been fighting, right? Her arms are crossed. They're not looking at each other. Maybe, again, a little bit of a reflection of Edward Hopper's own marriage. And here again, they're kind of shut out from the architecture too. So there's this sense of being closed off from things. But we also see that that the house abuts this field of very tall grass, and that's where we see this collie dog who seems like it has alerted to something that the human figures here have not yet noticed. And that almost spells out a little bit of danger, certainly some uncertainty. Something's about to happen. He doesn't let us know exactly what yet, but there's a sense of doom and gloom here, right? So Edward Hopper painted nearly 100 paintings, oil and watercolor in Cape Cod. And sometimes he would just drive around at night and then find interesting architecture. This is called Rooms for Tourists from 1945. This is at Yale University. And like Joe that we saw before painting in her car, he would just make a painting like this sitting in his car. How strange to think that you could be staying at a little B&B and there could be a master painter outside using the glow of the light in your room as a source of inspiration. But obviously so connected back to those images from New York City of being a voyeur, being in the train and looking into those windows. Now, perhaps one of Hopper's best loved images is this one here called Rooms by the Sea from 1951. This is also at Yale. Now, this kind of resembles what Hopper would have seen out of the door of their house in Truro. They lived so close to the water. They were up on this bluff, sort of overlooking the sea. And we have this really kind of almost alarming, ambiguous relationship again between the architecture and the water here. It certainly feels like with that door open, you could just fall out, spill over into the ocean. It doesn't make sense. It's hard to wrap your brain around, but at the same time, there's something kind of beautiful about it, kind of wonderful about it. And then there is this light in the foreground and then this nice parallelogram in the background too, reminding us that how Hopper said he was always really an impressionist. He's so concerned with this beautiful light in the foreground. So it's a painting that is at once very realistic, but also a little bit abstract and a little bit surrealistic. So it draws you in, it plays with our sensibility in terms of what's real, what is that creative invention side to Edward Hopper. I would say this is his most surreal painting, perhaps. It reminds me again of the themes that he was kind of blazing even as a young child, that sense of staring off into the ocean as a solitary figure. Get a little bit of that here. And even as an illustrator, he was so concerned with that connection of a solitary figure to the water. In this case, we can see an image from 1906 called The Boy in the Moon, where the walls of his home have broken down and he's looking out at the waves over here with the moon low in the sky here. So Edward Hopper seemed to always be concerned about connecting the figure with the ocean in this way. Now we're going to we've got very limited time, two big sections left. We're going to turn our attention to this connection between Hopper and film noir and film in general, really. This is an etching that he did called Night Shadows from 1921, where we are peeking out a window at a solitary figure who's moving through the night, this long shadow coming from presumably a street light. We get the sense that in this empty cityscape, he might be up to no good. uh, Edward Hopper said, when I don't have a mood for a painting, I go to the movies for a week or more. I go on a regular movie binge. So it's not surprising that the movies, especially like the classic movies from the 40s and the 50s, would have really had a big impact on him. And so with an image like this, we get the sense of like a crime drama from that era where the men were all wearing hats and, prowling the city streets sort of up to no good. But again, we have this wonderful sense of becoming a voyeur. Edward Hopper lends us that opportunity in so many of his compositions. Now, this next image here will probably feel familiar. This is his 1925 masterpiece called House by a Railroad. This is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's a painting of a grand Victorian house with this 4-story portico and, or I should say, projecting a tower here with the porticos down below, the mansard roof. It is a house with so much character. It's almost as though he's painted a portrait of a house here. Now, what doesn't align with this stately sort of late 19th century style is the fact that there's this high railroad in front of it. Sort of separating us from the house and adding this slice of sort of grating modernity in front of it. You almost get the sense that a blasting train whistle and a locomotive are going to come barreling through at any moment. Now he focuses on the sunlight on the side of that house, adding this sense of dread, this additional sense of dread, with these kind of looming shadows, particularly across the front. If you're a fan of film, you've probably already made the connection to the house from Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's movie from some years later. And this was very much inspired by this exact painting from Edward Hopper because it was so chilling. The house was built on a movie set. In fact, they didn't have enough funds to build the whole house. So it's kind of fun to see that they only built it from the same perspective that you see it in Edward Hopper's painting. And it was used, I think, for Psycho 1, Psycho 2, maybe even a few other movies, just because it is the embodiment of that sense of dread, right? And so we have a connection to other Alfred Hitchcock movies as well. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Rear Window, this whole idea of being inside an apartment or a home, but being able to watch other people's lives unfold in their illuminated apartments, and it kind of functioning like its own mystery, which is exactly what happens in Rear Window and exactly what happens in Edward Hopper's paintings. Here we can see a picture called Room in New York from 1932. And at first glance, it just seems like maybe a husband and wife in an illuminated interior. But we also get the sense that maybe something's just happened between the two of them. They're sort of disconnected here. We fill in the blanks for better or for worse. And that's certainly what Hitchcock portrayed in his movie. Now, sometimes filmmakers would borrow directly from Edward Hopper. In this case, there was a movie in the early 80s called Pennies from Heaven, starring Steve Martin. I believe it was like supposed to be film noir and like a rom-com musical maybe, but you can see here from a screen grab, they quote Edward Hopper's Nighthawks directly, as well as some other scenes. And if you're a fan of Perry Mason on HBO Max, you can see that the lighting and this sense of moodiness is directly borrowed from Edward Hopper's paintings. This is like a visual quote here, where we can see a painting called Conference at Night from 1949, and then Perry Mason with the lights kind of streaming in from the window. You always get the sense that there's some sort of nefarious meeting taking place under the cover of darkness here. All right, so in our last few moments, I'm so glad we've got some time for this, because this is what I really kind of have fun with when it comes to Edward Hopper, beyond realism. So like I mentioned at the get-go, Edward Hopper kept this style, this crisp, sort of discernible style, still mysterious, throughout his entire career. And this as well all of these different emerging avant-garde styles were breaking out during the 20th century. There were so many revolutions in painting. It's hard to imagine that he was impervious to it. I would say there are very interesting relationships between Edward Hopper and so many avant-garde artists. Maybe a little bit of influence, maybe a little bit of dabbling. What we are looking at here is a comparison between the Italian artist Giorgio de Cerco's painting. He's sort of like a precursor to the surrealists here. He was known for creating these vacant city squares with very long shadows, oftentimes including a train. We know that Edward Hopper loved trains. And I think when you compare that to something like Night Shadows, which we already saw, we get a sense of that same kind of isolation and the dread that those long shadows from a cityscape can create in a scene like this. So maybe there was a little bit of some cross-pollination there. It does seem as though there's a relationship between surrealist artist Rene Magritte and maybe some of Edward Hopper's paintings. This is Magritte's 1933 work called The Human Condition, and of course the jumping off point from 1951 on the right. Now, Magritte would oftentimes play with the sense of what you're looking at through a window is some sort of illusion that can be, tied back to like a painting on an easel, like we see over here. And it's all painted with these crisp, clear blue skies and a sense of realism here that has been pared down, sort of stripped down to its bare essentials. And I would say that we get the same kind of style, and especially in Rooms by the Sea, that same kind of unexpected illusion in some of Edward Hopper's paintings. So again, maybe a little bit of cross-pollination between these two as well. Now, this painting here by Edward Hopper just knocks my socks off. It's called Chop Suey. I believe this is from 1929. There's so much going on here. At first glance, I mean, maybe if you're like me, my eye goes right to this young woman with the red lipstick who seems to be looking out directly at us, but maybe she's engaged here in a conversation with the person that she's dining with. We seem to be on the second floor of a Chinese restaurant. We can see just the bottom of the chop suey sign here that's illuminated through this window on the right. Now, what fascinates me is that Edward Hopper has obscured this window. He never does that. In fact, he never paints glass really in his windows. This is a strange choice. We can still see the bottom of the Y of that sign, but what was he doing? Why did he choose to create this kind of muddled mess over the window here? How does this enhance his painting in any way? Well, as I gazed at that, what that reminded me of was experiments in non-objective painting in the early 20th century. This is not Edward Hopper's style at all. The artist here is on the right is named Vasily Kandinsky, who's doing this kind of painting a decade or so before Edward Hopper's chop suey painting. But what we can see here are really just experiments in color and form. Subjects in art that Edward Hopper was so interested in. And I think adding this little green screen here allowed him to do something like what Vasily Kandinsky was doing in his abstract paintings like this. It freed him up even just in, the space of a little parallelogram. So looking at that window, then I had to look at the window in the back. And this seems like a really strange choice for Edward Hopper as well. If this is a front window, presumably looking out onto a city street, this is maybe an alley window over here. And what we get are like these beams of light that seem to kind of crisscross each other. This is also pretty unusual for Edward Hopper. It reminded me of the way American artists were fragmenting light and space around this time. Artists like Charles Demuth, who created this image over here on the right just a couple of years before Chop Suey. This is a work called My Egypt from 1927. And Demuth's work was was really at the forefront in American art. I don't think it would be unreasonable to think that Edward Hopper hadn't been exposed to this kind of fragmentation by other artists, and maybe prior to painting this, and maybe he just wanted to do a little bit of it himself, not completely abandon, the path that he was on, but trying out a little bit of what other artists were doing, which brings us back now to Nighthawks. Now I'm going to share with you my craziest theory. Are you ready for this? Okay. It involves the interior of this diner that we see here. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the way he painted the door all the way over on the right. It is so emphatically flat. Almost everything else has like a door jamb or some sort of architectural detail. As we look at this door, it doesn't even really seem to align with the linear perspective in the space. It's a strange element here, and there are no door jambs. There's no architectural detail. It looks like it has this little square window, which again doesn't seem to align with the perspective in the space. When I look at that door with its square window, with its rectangular kind of brass panel there for pushing, it reminds me of the kinds of color theory experiments that an artist like Paul Klee was doing around the same time, where he was just pairing, these little blocks of color together in really satisfying ways. It's almost as though Edward Hopper was thinking, I can do something sort of similar to that, with a little bit of a play at the back of this masterwork of his. Now, I want to bring our eyes back to now to those coffee pots that I had mentioned before, and how they're almost like characters in and of themselves in this painting. We know that Hopper spent a lot of time focusing on them, and I want to draw your attention to the fact that Edward Hopper, in between those coffee pots that he cared so much about, just leaves this one long drip of amber paint here. Is this a mistake? It doesn't seem like a mistake. You can hone in, you can find a really nice high resolution image of this work online, and there's no other drip like that. Is it a nod to the coffee pots themselves? Who knows? Or is it Edward Hopper kind of playing with the viscosity of paint and the nature of paint itself, even before somebody like Jackson Pollock was doing drip and splatter paintings? This is the early 1940s. Other artists were already kind of experimenting with it, but I will say there's something that seems very purposeful in that perfectly centered drip over there, and I think he might have been experimenting a little. So one of our last experiments with, or perhaps this is me just making up some theories here. Maybe one of the last nods to modernism that we'll look at here is Edward Hopper's painting Office in a Small City. This is from 1953, and this is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, we've already seen this motif from Edward Hopper, where we're looking into somebody's window and we can kind of see through their space through an additional window, so kind of the corner of a building like this. And we can see a man at a desk, and beyond this building that he's in, we can see maybe a row of Victorian style apartments, multi-story apartments here with, vents and that sort of thing all along the top. And then what seems to be a very modern building off in the distance that doesn't seem to have like the Victorian or the 19th century architectural details here. It's essentially just a block of almost unmodulated white paint. There's a stripe in it, and then just a little block on the top of it here. And that, well, it got me thinking that what this man is looking at, what he sees through his window almost functions as its own geometric abstract painting. Notice too that that some of the rounded, more ornate details of the Victorian building in the front are gone in front of him. It really just seems to be geometric abstraction. And that building with just that stripe down the center or down the edge here reminds me of a style of painting that kind of broke through around the same time by an artist named Barnett Newman. So maybe Hopper was looking out at what other artists were doing and thinking he could with some confidence, integrate that style of painting as part of his realist approach to documenting life in the 20th century. So we'll wrap up today almost right on time with just reviewing and pulling together how we understand who Edward Hopper was, what his contributions were. We know that he was a cantankerous man. We know that he was melancholy, and we saw how this played out in his marriage and in his artwork, his interest in the solitary figures, his themes of alienation and loneliness. We also know that he created enduring and fascinating works that are ambiguous, evocative, and experimental. He saw his paintings as a way to express his inner imagination, his interior self, and he did so effectively for more than half a century. Some of his paintings were oftentimes about his relationship. This is called Two Puritans over here and Two Comedians on the right. And he noted that both of these works were about his marriage. In fact, The Comedians was his final painting, and it's him and Joe taking their final bow. So as tumultuous as that relationship was, it is one that persisted. And so we're reminded that she played a critical role in his art, in his career. Here are the couple at the very end of their lives. They managed to stay married for nearly half of a century. Edward Hopper died in his studio in 1967 at the age of 84. Joe died about 10 months later. She ended up donating about 3,000 of his works and hers to the Whitney Museum of Art. It was really an unprecedented museum gift at the time. You'll never believe this. The Whitney Museum accepted all of Edward Hopper's paintings and only 3 of Joe's. They redistributed her works to places in the city where women waited or passed through, primarily like hospital waiting rooms and that sort of thing. So in terms of his legacy, I unfortunately, her legacy was probably marred by that, but I think art historians have growing interest in her. But in terms of his legacy, it just keeps getting stronger. President Obama selected works from the Whitney by Edward Hopper for display in the Oval Office when he was president. And I always love to look at auction records too. For quite some time, Edward Hopper's paintings were hovering around the 20 million mark, but Chop Suey went up for auction in 2018 and it sold for a record-breaking $91.9 million, which means Edward Hopper is up there in the realm of like Andy Warhol and Jean-Michel Basquiat. He's really one of the greatest American painters, at least when it comes to the auction block. So when it comes to Edward Hopper, I think his work is always simultaneously fulfilling and frustrating to look at because we never truly know what he's trying to convey. There's always more than meets the eye when it comes to Hopper. But I think he'll continue to serve as a cultural touchstone and we'll continue to see his reputation and his auction prices soar. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Edward Hopper. I'll start taking a look at the chat right now too. Oh, Tish asked, why is he one of my favorites? I think because his images draw me in with the mystery. I love the way that they're painted. I love the colors he uses. And I think I always want to try and figure out the story too. Joyce says, vertical lines are often slightly diagonal. Why do you think this is in many of his paintings? It's a fascinating observation, Joyce. I don't know if I've noticed that. I wonder. I'm not sure the why, but I would imagine it provides a little bit of visual interest. I'm not sure why. I'm going to have to look more closely, Joyce. Somebody said, how did he support himself? That is a great question. When he did sell his oil paintings, they sold very well. So like Nighthawk's $3,000 in 1942, that was an excellent payday for him. So by the time he met Joe, by the time they got married, his career started to soar with her help in kind of managing it. So he could get a good payday out of those 5 paintings that he would do per year. Patricia says, did Hopper serve in World War One? As far as I know, he did not, and I don't know the reason why offhand. Lori says, what is the difference between an image and a picture? I oftentimes use those words interchangeably. And interestingly, in museum education, you are always supposed to say the word picture because it doesn't allow anyone to assess themselves out of the process. If we call it a picture, everyone's had the experience of looking at a picture together. If I call it, a gouache or an etching or something, somebody might think, well, I don't know how that's made. You can get into that later. But if we're looking at an image, if we're looking at a picture, we all have had that experience before and we can all do it. So maybe that's why I use it. I've had all this training in museum education. Stephen said the male protagonist Nighthawk seems very inconspicuous in appearance and the woman very conspicuous. I wonder if there's some statement or perspective here. That's interesting. She does seem very heavily made up. I feel like both of them look pretty darn suspicious, I can say. Yeah, but she seems to draw a lot of attention between the dress, the hair, the makeup. It makes us wonder what the nature of that relationship is. Great observation there. Somebody asks, is Hopper's house in Truro still standing? Is it a private home still? Oh my goodness. I meant to look this up yesterday as I was doing my follow-up research. I looked into this years ago when I first put this program together, and I'm sorry I don't have that information at the top of my head. I do know that there were all sorts of disputes between neighbors because people were tourists were trying to go and look at that house. I believe it is privately owned, but by people who are interested in preserving his legacy. We'd have to double check that though. Mary, hi Mary, thank you for being here. In that first film noir painting, the shadow from the light pole is going one way and the shadow the man is going from a different way, not realistic. What was he doing? Great question, Mary. For that, I would say he's probably trying to suggest that there are multiple light sources, like there are street lights in different directions, but I'm glad you noticed that. Oh yeah, I see what you're saying now. That makes no sense, Mary. I don't know what he was doing there. Great attention to detail. Stephen says, when you showed the boy in the moon, I was waiting for you to say something about the influence of Japanese woodblock, but you did not. And I do not really know what Japanese woodblock is to know whether my reaction is right or not. I think you're onto something there, Stephen. I think you're right. I started dropping that image into the program because I thought it kind of connected to his connection to the sea and the solitary figure, but I think you're onto something there. And he's somebody who was fascinated by the Impressionists who were all influenced by Japanese woodblock prints. So especially now that I'm looking at all the patterns on the bed and that sort of thing, yeah, I think you're on the right track there. Jackie says, Richard Diebekorn comes to mind. Thanks. I'm not as familiar with him. Jackie, thanks for mentioning him. I'll look him up. Was David Hockney in his Splash series inspired by Edward Hopper, although his colors are brighter? Am I way out? I think you're on the right track there. Whenever I look at Hockney, I think of Hopper. I think there's a great deal of influence there. Nancy says, Frida, Georgia Joe, all second best to their partners. Maybe we think of it that way. Maybe in a century, we'll be talking about it in a different way. Joe deserves a lot of credit. As I was reviewing this program yesterday, I was thinking Joe needs her own art talk. Stephen says, that looks like a bedpost outside the window of the building. Oh, sorry, Stephen. I don't know which one you're thinking of. That might be Night Shadows, right? A bedpost outside the building, maybe. Could be. Who knows? Sharon says, what is that thing that looks like a bedpost in the lower right? The man behind the desk. Oh, okay. I think that was this one. Oh, yeah, that does look like a bedpost there. It's a really good question. It almost looks like a Victorian or like facade or something that's been applied to what otherwise looks like a modern building, which would be a pretty unusual thing. I have no idea what that is. It's a really strange detail, right? And it reminds us of how ornate everything is over in this little slice of the picture, and then how streamlined and modern everything is beyond that. Great attention to detail. I wish I could provide a little bit more information for you there. Somebody asked, did he leave any diaries? And I don't believe he did. There aren't a lot of great Edward Hopper quotes out there, so I have a feeling there aren't diaries, but I could be wrong about that. Most people always just go back to that quote about painting the side of a house. All he ever wanted to do. He seemed to be a man of few words. Hopper seemed to like yellow in his painting, especially he used yellow in rugs and wall color, contrast to his moody behavior. Great attention to detail there, Maxine. I didn't even notice that. And it's funny. Yep, we see it in Nighthawks right there, right? And it's like this bright lemon yellow color. It's almost hard to look at, right? Unexpected when we think of him as being a melancholy character, but it creates this wonderful contrast with the greens and the blues here. Friedel says, did he take art lessons by mail that used to be advertised on matchbooks? Well, he did go to a correspondence school, so maybe that's what was happening there. He lived fairly close to New York City growing up, so I think he probably traveled in. I'm not sure if it was like specifically the one in matchbooks, but that could be it. Rob, thanks for your kind words. He said, I love the stripe between the coffee urns, which I never particularly noticed before. It can also serve as coffee stains. As one who haunts cafes, I can attest that the changeover of urns can indeed be messy. Thanks for adding that, Rob. And I'm glad you appreciated that little dalliance there. I took part in a class for museum educators some time ago that took place at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we spent maybe 3 hours in front of this painting. It was incredible. It was indulgent, and it just like the little details that you see after a really long look like that with other people who just love to talk about art. Ooh, that should be another kind of program that we do together, because the details really emerge and you start wondering all sorts of great things like that. Oh, Alice says it's not a private house. Alice, thanks for adding that in, looking that up. And so it might be, oh, it's like used for retreats or something like that. I can't remember. Linda says the gentleman in the forefront of Nighthawk seems to be Edward Hopper as an observer. Oh, Linda, I love that. Maybe this man right here is sort of like a projection of the artist observing everything there. I love that. Just deciding to include him is such an interesting choice. We could spend an hour talking about this painting. Somebody else said in one of the latest slides of his work, with a man looking out the window towards brown buildings, what was the structure? That is like that bedpost thing that we couldn't really figure out. Yeah, I'm not sure what that is. Sorry about that. Linda asked, who purchased chop suey? Good question. I'm not sure if I have that in my notes. Let's see. Sorry, Linda, I don't, but we could probably track that down. I hope it went into a museum collection. Tamara says the Cape Ann Museum had the exhibit of Edward Hopper and Joe's work in 2023. Oh, thanks for adding all this information about the shows and the museum collections. Thank you so much for adding that. And I'm kicking myself that I missed that show at the Cape Ann Museum because everybody loved it. Deborah says, did he cross paths with Rockwell when doing illustration? I'm not sure if they ever met particularly. It does seem as though there was some disdain there between, or at least Hopper might have had some disdain for Rockwell. I think that there are fascinating connections between their work. In fact, that was going to be like a whole other section of of this program. It could have gone on forever, but I mean, it's like it's almost as though Rockwell could take Hopper's paintings and then populate them and make them these sweet little vignettes, right? It seems like there's a lot of cross-pollination there. I had another one of these, but it's probably much further down in my slides. Forgive the whiplash, but look at this one. I mean, the sense of like the usherette who's so isolated. So you and I, Deborah, thanks for bringing up Rockwell, because I'm always thinking of him. Mary said, by incorporating bits and pieces of modern art techniques in his otherwise realistic paintings, do you think he was mocking the modern styles, subsuming them as just a small piece in the reality of his paintings? Mary, you put that so beautifully. There's no way I'm going to contest that. That is almost without a doubt what he was doing. It sounds right. It sounds right to me. I don't know if we have any definitive answer, but that sounds beautiful, Mary. Thanks for sharing that. Madeline says, did Hopper ever speak about his societal or political views? If not, as you said, he didn't like to interpret his paintings. He lived from the American Victorian through post-World War II era, so I think he speaks to societal changes and the coldness of modernity. What do you think? I'm not sure if I know anything about his political views per se. I remember reading like a few offhand comments here or there, but it's not what I focused on, sorry, in preparing for today. It does seem that his paintings reflect the new era of modernity, this era of being alone in a crowd, of feeling isolated. So it does seem to comment on, or at least capture that. I'm not sure if that was part of like a bigger philosophy or political viewpoint, Madeline, but you're so good to ask. It makes me curious now. So I'm sure a bunch of people will be Googling that. Carol says the Edward Hopper House is in Nyack, New York. Thanks for adding the website for that. Somebody said, I read that Joe was the model for most of Hopper's paintings. Could that be why he didn't paint more portraits of her? That could be why. And I believe she sort of insisted on being the model. He didn't want her bringing around young girls for a lot of things. So she was the stand-in. Wendy's here. Wendy, nice to see your name. She said in Chop Suey, can you please repeat whose work inspired the insert in the window? Now, this is just my crazy theory, Wendy. Are you ready for this? It made me think of the artist Kandinsky, Vasily Kandinsky, who was painting these kinds of abstractions in like 1913 or so. An anonymous buyer bought chop suey. Thank you for adding that. Funny how Rockwell is considered an illustrator and Hopper an artist. Those two works he showed side by side look so similar, right? And it's just like the splitting the hair of creating work on demand or for yourself, right? But themes were obviously bubbling to the surface that were very similar for both of them. Joan says, do you think someone like Hopper knows they will be famous? Interesting. I have no idea. I'm not even sure fame was important to him because he just seemed like such an ornery guy. That's going to get me thinking, though. What was success like for him? How did he think about it? You raise an interesting topic. Let's see here. Did he intentionally put in symbols and repetition of items in a painting, or is that an unconscious choice? It seems to me that it's very conscious. It seems like he was repeating shapes and forms and colors to create this kind of visual rhythm in his pictures. And that would have been something that probably learned in art school. And then let's see, in the office painting, the big white wall on the left looks like a tank, like for petroleum. The shadows give it a round shape. Ooh, that's an interesting take. That's I think that last painting that we were looking at, right? It's a strange one. It gets you thinking, doesn't it? And Tamara, I think, added in the information about the Cape Ann Museum. Already asked to have paintings at the Brooklyn Museum. Yes, thank you so much for adding in the influence of Joe Hopper there. Now there's more, I think, in the chat here. I'll take a look at that. Very kind words that I really, really appreciate. Let's see. Many of his figures have their backs to us, adding to the mystery, right, Margot? It's like we have to wonder what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and then we project ourselves into it and we imagine what we would be thinking and feeling with those. Frank, thanks for being here. Thanks for your kind words. Oh, I love this interpretation. The Beetlejuice home. I know exactly what you're talking about. That redone a sort of Victorian home in the movie Beetlejuice. Art lessons by mail. We covered the Addams Family house, sort of looks like that. For sure, the house by the railroad. Ooh. Margot says Bernadette Peters, and I feel like you're talking about Nighthawks here. The elongated shadow appears like a stiletto knife. Wow. See, there's so much mystery here. The windows have lines going down the center too, cohesive. Deborah, I agree. A toxic relationship. Wendy says in chop suey. I think we answered that one. And then I think some of these were repeated from the Q&A. Thank you all for your very kind words. I think we got to everything. Thanks again, everybody, for spending your Halloween morning with me. This was so much fun.
So, folks, let's give Jane a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation and for like literally answering 30 questions. So, Jane, wonderful job as always. We do have Jane coming back in November. I believe it's going to be Thursday, November 14th. So in like 2 weeks, Jane will be back to talk about George Tooker. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right.
If you've never heard of George Tooker, if you like Edward Hopper, you will love George Tooker. Yeah, it's very similar. Yeah.
Yeah, so that'll be in 2 weeks on Thursday, November 14th, 10:30. You'll have that information in the follow-up email I send you all either today or tomorrow. And then on Thursday, December 12th at 10:30, Jane will be tackling Marc Chagall. So all that information will be in the email you receive along with the recording. Please take 30 to 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey when you exit the Zoom. And as Jane said, I hope everyone has a wonderful, happy Halloween. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again, Jane.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.